In the wake of Brexit, France and Germany will assume European leadership in handling issues such as collective defense in the absence of the US, defending multilateral institutions, and facilitating further regional integration despite the rise of populism. At the same time, trade conflicts between the US and China and changes in power equation cast a shadow on the prospects of globalization and co-prosperity. How will France view the growing rivalries between Washington and Beijing? Will the principle of multilateralism be protected? And can the rise of China be peaceful in the observation of Europeans? In the first half of the program, I'm delighted to talk to Mr. Thierry de Montbrel, Executive Chairman of the French Research Institute of International Relations. And in the second half, I shall be talking to Mr. Pascal Boniface, Founding Director of the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Montbrel. As you are the founding chairman of the Research Institute of International Relations here in France, what is your threat assessment about the challenges that not only France but Germany and other major powers in the continent are facing? Is it Russia? Is it non-conventional threats from extremism? What are the biggest challenges for the collective security of the European Union?
Well, there is one missing point in what you are saying. The missing point is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were faced with a situation that none of us had or could have anticipated. That is, we had, to enlarge very, very fast, very quickly, the European Union, which before then was called the European Community. So to enlarge so quickly the European Union to countries which have been for decades under authoritarian or dictatorial regime under the umbrella of the Soviet Union, but also before that who had been through the Nazi regime, that is almost more than half a century of very, very difficult domestic situations. To absorb these countries was an extremely difficult task. And these days everybody is talking about the 30th anniversary of the fall of the opening of the Berlin Wall. But even still now, 30 years after, in spite of the thousands of billions of dollars or euros which have been invested to develop the eastern part of Germany, the difference is still visible. So, it was a formidable task. So we have suffered from this necessity to enlarge too fast.
What are the differences that still exist between East and West Germany?
Well, the economic differences, because the economic development is not easy. I think in China, after all, the hard part of before the reforms with Deng Xiaoping, the pure socialist regime was less than one generation, whereas it was 3 generations in the case of the Soviet Union and more or less 2 in Eastern Europe. So, to repair the damage of the authoritarian regimes takes much more than 1 generation, and it is the case with the eastern part of Germany. But my point is that it is bigger than that. So the first challenge for the European Union is to consolidate its internal basis. We have also external challenges. I think that Russia should be and could be overcome, because I think we have mishandled the situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union, especially the last decade of last century. So I hope...
Are you actually talking about the eastward expansion that has upset, first of all, former President Boris Yeltsin, and then his successor, Putin, was not very happy about this?
And not only Yeltsin, not only Putin, because before Putin, I think the Russians were not particularly happy about the eastern expansion of NATO, that essentially NATO. So I think that we have to recreate confidence, trust, the word I was using, with Russia, and I think it is possible with some good
Mr.
diplomacy.
Lavrov, the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, is sitting just next to us
Yes.
here in the panel. What do you want to say to him if you were to discuss collective security of Europe?
Well, actually, I have occasions now and then to discuss with him. So just before this meeting, I just exchanged a few words with him. You see, the Russians themselves had offered about 10 years ago to review the Helsinki process, CSC, of the mid-70s of last century. And I think it could make sense to follow their own ideas and to review the security, to review together, the security issues in Europe. And I think that could be a good starting point. And of course, I would also advise the Americans, which is not easy today. It's easier to talk to Mr. Lavrov or to Mr. Putin than to Mr. Trump. But I think that the U.S.
Excuse me, in your assessment, do you actually suggest quietly that Russia is potentially the biggest geopolitical threat to your continental security, and at the same time, the future of the NATO is called into question by President Emmanuel Macron in the interview with The Economist, the journal. He said, in fact, the NATO is brain dead. That has caused an uproar and a lot of controversies surrounding his remarks about the future of the NATO. Do you agree with your president?
Well, actually, I said it myself in many interviews much before President Macron's interview. And I think I said it to my Chinese friends about 10 days ago in Beijing. Yes, I think NATO is in trouble. NATO is in trouble just because the reasons for NATO was the Soviet Union threat. And there is no longer a Soviet Union threat. Russia is much smaller than the Soviet Union.
But it still has the nuclear arsenal that could destroy Europe over and over. And even the United States could also be destroyed through what we call the mutually assured destruction theory.
No, I think that the nuclear dimension of power has to be dealt with as such anyway, because the stakes about using nuclear weapons are so high that it needs special diplomacy and rules. And this is why I condemn President Trump very much for irresponsibility, having cancelled, having withdrawn from the arms control agreement with Russia. I think it is extremely important to restore arms control, which was, I think, a positive heritage from the Cold War era. Now, the fact that the United States is less interested in Europe and more interested in Asia is a fact. And it is a fact which is very logical considering the changes of the world. And this is why it's important, I think, for Europe to recreate some sense of a common destiny with Russia. The problem is not to force Russia to change its internal institutions. It's not in our possibilities. But we have a community of fate, and this has to be recognized. So Europe, I think, Europe at large has to reconstruct security structure with, of course, the United States. The United States should not be absent from that, but with a different role from the past.
Mr. Mombrel, even from the Bosnia-Herzegovina warfare, European leaders started to realize they could not bet their future on the American leadership.
This is what I'm saying too.
Exactly. So when you say the United States, the Trump administration, even earlier, showed less interest in European affairs, why don't you also share this opinion that President Putin and his government also show less interest in Europe than in Asia or the Indo-Pacific region? It is going east. the Russian government wants to forge not necessarily alliance with the PRC, but it's something next to an alliance of mutual, a kind of a treaty alliance. So what do you think of the the Indo-Pacific strategy, as opposed to what we have been discussing, the collective security of Europe in the face of, a weak destiny of the NATO, which was set up at the height of the Cold War?
Well, I think there are at least two separate issues in what you're saying. First, I think that the rapprochement between Russia and China and more generally India is a relatively natural move, especially after having felt rejected by the West. So to some extent this rapprochement is a consequence of the deterioration of the relations between Russia and the West. But it has, I think, also its internal logics, because Russia is also an Asian power, and therefore its participation or its efforts to participate to Asian development has a lot of meaning. But never forget, though, that most of the population of Russia is European. It is about, we have about 110 million inhabitants west of the Ural Mountains, and no more than 30 million, probably less, east of the Urals. Which means that the future, geographically speaking, the future of Russia is more towards the west than towards the east. And culturally, of course, it is the same. The vast majority of the Russian population feels European culturally, not Asian. So again, the problem is not, I think, to choose the West or Europe against China or Asia, or vice versa. This is the wrong way to put the problem. I think Russia has 2 feet, one in Europe, one in Asia, but I think the European leg is stronger, bigger, if you wish, than the
In fact, most policymakers and elites in Russia are wrestling with the idea whether they should fall into the category of Europe or Asia.
Yes.
They have been long involved in the process of debating national identification about whether they should belong to the Pacific or the European continent. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Are you suggesting there would be no winners for any trade
only
war?
loser.
Only lose-lose situation.
Yeah, lose. US will lose something, China will lose also something, but EU will lose.
Why is Washington consistently and obsessively concerned about the prospect that Russia will rise and will deliver global impact?
They need an enemy to have important military expenditure. And it's also a way to say to European countries, look, you think that you could be independent, but it's not true, because there is still a Russian threat.
Welcome to Dialogue, Monsieur Pascal Boniface. Let me first of all know whether the European Union finds it very difficult to take side at this defining moment of China-US relations.
Because if there is a struggle between US and China, we are not obliged to take side on one or the other side. And we have good relations with China, we have good relations with USA, and I think that the trade war between the two countries will be a huge challenge for us and for everybody. I think that the EU position is to try to avoid a trade war between China and US and between everybody, because we do not think that a trade war is easy to win or is something which could produce something good. As the contrary.
Are you suggesting there would be no winners for any trade
only
war?
Loser.
Only loser. Lose-lose situation.
Yeah, US will lose something, China will lose also something, but EU will lose.
Let's look at trade dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO. The United States has seriously reduced the number of judges on the appellate body of the WTO. It means there wouldn't be judges to examine the legal cases between the two biggest economies. And this appellate body is said to be the jewel of the crown. If it ceases to work, then the World Trade Organization, will cease to have the legitimacy for its survival, for its function, for its performance. What do you think of the crisis?
It will be a disaster if the WTO is not in a position to continue its work. Recently, WTO has condemned as fine Europe and France for too much protecting Airbus, and we have accepted it. It's the multilateral way. And I think that it's US position and Trump position is to fight the multilateral organization, including WTO. And at the end of the day, if United Nations, UNESCO, WTO are not able to work again, it will be a disaster for everybody. And we are living in a global world. And in this global world, we need global institutions. And we need to accept the rule of multilateralism. The way Trump is acting regarding UNESCO, regarding WTO, regarding the JCPOA, the agreement on Iranian nuclear deal, I think it's a totally wrong way, and it could lead only to a more unilateral position.
Pascal, despite the short-lived honeymoon trip between France and the United States since Nicolas Sarkozy's years, do you think President Macron is going back to the essence of Charles de Gaulle's foreign policy of independence? I mean, is it true that the French government, under the leadership of President Macron, is becoming more independent? And some of his remarks about the future of the NATO has caused controversies recently and generated a lot of headlines.
That's true. During the electoral campaign in 2017, Macron has referred himself to the Gaulo-Mitterrandist. What is Gaulo-Mitterrandist policy? It's a policy defined by de Gaulle first and enhanced by Mitterrand after. It's a position in which France is allied but not aligned on US policy. And we are our own policy due to, as we are a nuclear power, during the Cold War, we do not need US nuclear umbrella because we had our own umbrella. And that has created a very independent French position. And even if the Cold War is over, I think it's still true. And Macron has more or less criticized his two predecessors, both Sarkozy and Hollande, to be too much aligned on US and to be too much Atlanticist. And he wants to come back to the Gaulo-Mitterrandist policy. And I think his last declaration on NATO has fueled a lot of criticism, even in Europe, even in Germany. Even Angela Merkel has told that NATO is still the cornerstone of US and European security. In fact, he has just told the truth. NATO is in crisis because mostly the US president is no longer a believer in NATO. The US President, Donald Trump, has stated that NATO is obsolete. So when the US President, who is the leader of NATO, stated that NATO is obsolete, what could we do?
Then the next question, Pascal, is how likely it will be for the Europeans to set up its own defense forces? It will no longer rely on the NATO for its own defense, despite the alleged threats coming from Russia, after their annexation, quote unquote, of Crimea?
I think the Crimea file is very specific. It's not a precedent, it's an exception. Because, as you know, Crimea was given to Ukraine during the Soviet times by the Khrushchev decision. And Crimea was a Russian population, Russian-speaking people. They want to become Russian. So I don't think that once Crimea has been annexed by Russia, Russia will annex other part of European countries. And if you look at figures, the total of Russian military expenditures are $60 billion. The European military expenditures, the European members of NATO, it's $240 billion.
A lot more than the Russian defense spending.
Four times
more than the Russian.
And so there is
spending.
no real Soviet threat. There is a strategic challenge from Russia, because we are not agree on Syria, we are not agree on Ukraine, and perhaps we could hope to have a new agreement between the new Ukrainian president and Putin. But if it is true that we have some difficulties on strategic issue with Russia, it's false to say that there is a Russian threat, because it was true during the Soviet times. It's no longer true now. But I think that in NATO headquarters, they talk about a Russian threat to maintain NATO and to maintain a kind of US hegemony over European countries.
But despite the apparent weakness of the Russian military might, why is Washington consistently and obsessively concerned about the prospect that Russia will rise and will deliver global impact because of the geopolitical reconfiguration? I mean, Russia, as you said, could somehow be brushed aside and should not be taken as seriously as during the Cold War regarding the former Soviet Union. But why do you think Americans are still so concerned about Russia?
For many reasons. I think it's the weight of habits. They are used to see Moscow as an enemy, and even if the Soviet Union is no longer existing, Russia is still in their mind as a survivor of Soviet Union. But there is also a strategic interest. They need an enemy to survive. They need an enemy to have important military expenditure. The US military budget is $700 billion. It's much more than during the Cold War. And so they need to say that there is a Russian threat to have this huge budget. And it's in fact a side effect of the strength of the military complex. And it's also a way to say to European countries, look, you think that you could be independent, but it's not true, because there is still a Russian threat, even if the Soviet Union is no longer existing. And so it's a way to keep an hegemony due to the so-called protection of European countries. And so due to NATO and due to the spectre of Russian threat, US is still very powerful inside Europe.
For years, in my observation, that the Americans have been enslaved by their own self-fulfilling prophecy regarding the future of the world, and particularly who should be taken on as the enemy. Now, several policy documents have been released by the Pentagon, the White House, and the State Department outlining China as a strategic threat to the national security of the United States of America. But China says, come on, we don't have any global ambition to threaten your national stakes. But whatever we say, whatever we do, we are always accused of being assertive, posing a threat to the United States. Is that true that they are looking for a threat? They're looking for an enemy. They want to justify the huge military spending of the military industrial complex. What is it from your perspective?
There is many different explanations. First, it's true that China will become the most important nation in the world. And the question is not if China will overpass US, but when it will do it. And so in some years, China will become the first player in the world. And in US perspective, it's dramatic, because they are used to be the first one and the number one still since 45. When I began to work on strategic issues in the 80s, France has 3 more important GDP than China. Now it's the reverse. China is much more important on GDP than France. But it's not a matter of anxiety for France, because we were not the #1 power in the world in the 80s. And so I think China is a challenge for us to adapt, to try to cope with the challenge. But it's not a threat for us, and we have to do our job to take advantage of the China race and not to be overpassed by China on some issue. But US being for so many times the #1 power, it's difficult for them to see that they will be overpassed by another one. And it's a so-called Thucydides trap, in which they say that when the #1 power is challenged by the #2, it could lead to war.
Pascal, the next issue is very much about the global implications of the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. Why do you think most Westerners feel a little bit uneasy about this idea that China will make investment in many parts of the world? And the purpose of China's business presence throughout the world is to help construct infrastructure, particularly in developing countries. And yet they came up with the theory of a debt trap, lack of transparency. So a lot of excuses have been created to discredit the China's global expansion.
But the Chinese must realize that their growth, that their rise, it's a huge challenge for every other nations. And you must realize that you are so important that, of course, we need to cope and to face your rise. It's not so natural for other countries. And regarding Belt and Road Initiative, that's true that the world is lacking of infrastructure. And if China is building a new airport, new port, new railways, it will be useful for everybody. But as you have mentioned, there is a debt trap, which is, and even Mr. Mahathir has raised the issue, so he's not anti-Chinese, he's not pro-American, he's very Asian. But I think what you must realize that this is an important issue, and also that we need to have a more open Chinese market. And I think that the Belt and Road Initiative would be very helpful for everybody if the Chinese market is a little bit more open. But I think it's better to export infrastructure than to export war. And I think that the Chinese contribution to infrastructure system in the world would be very appreciated.
President Macron was the only European leader, the only European leader of a major country to have participated in the second conference of China Import Expo in Shanghai. And President Xi Jinping promised over and over that our door will be thrown wider and wider, and that China is ready to, for example, use the foreign investment law to promote transparency and to follow rules in a rule-based world. Well, thank you very much. This part of the dialogue will help Europeans understand China better, and I really appreciate your insightful analysis.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.